Hello, I'm very excited today to have the brilliant Peter Oborne. Peter, for those who, if you don't know who he is, sort out, but has an extremely long and illustrious career in the British media, which is very relevant because we'll be talking about that. And before I just say a bit more about him, I think people are probably bored of me using the term moral clarity, but Peter Oborne, for me, has long epitomised that very concept, which we're in desperate need of when we're talking about the horrors, obviously, of everything that's happened since 7th of October. He's associate editor of Middle East Eye, superb, must read throughout this whole conflict, and also their videos. They really are an invaluable resource. He's also the author of the book Fate of Abraham, Why the West is Wrong About Islam. Huge relevance, obviously, in terms of what we're talking about today. And also so learned about Palestine, about Israel, spent huge amounts of time in Palestine, and last year, 7 months in Jerusalem. Peter, that was a long spiel, but it was necessary because, you are a very esteemed guest. Hello, how are you?
I'm very well. Lovely to meet you again, Owen.
Let's just start, I think, with, because now we've had the ICJ ruling last week. So we've had actually 5 days for Israel to comply. What would you say in terms of now? Because, in terms of what the ICJ ruling was and what's actually happened since, what would be your evaluation?
It's a fascinating case study in how the Western political media class covers and reacts to events in Israel/Palestine. And so if you look at the ICJ document and court ruling, was very, very powerful. It found that there were grounds for believing that Israel was committing genocide, and it didn't make a final ruling on this, but he found there were grounds to believing this, and therefore there had to be some measures taken by Israel to avert this calamity, and it pointed as proof to the genocidal statements made by many of the most senior Israeli leaders, including the president, the prime minister, and mimicked around the places we've seen in these awful tapes from these IDF people. It was absolutely a devastating document, and was the reaction to it I have found astonishing. Let's take the example of the London Times, which claims to be a newspaper of record, Britain's perhaps leading broadsheet, etc., leading newspaper. On the Saturday, the day after the ruling, I looked through the Times. I found a small piece on page 3 of the World's, what they call the World section, page 42 of the Times itself. That was the only coverage. The following day, I looked at the Sunday Times, ditto. You had to go to the back of the book and you found a piece about South Africa being anti-Semitic. And really, the Times has not covered this. It does not cover the findings. But what has simultaneously happened, and you'll find the same narrative everywhere, is that suddenly the UNRWA story gets unleashed.
So that's the UN agency which looks after the main humanitarian agency in Gaza.
Yeah, looking after the refugees. I mean, as there have been really since 1948. And suddenly you get this UNRWA story that there are a small number, according to Israel, of UNRWA people who were involved in the atrocities committed by Hamas on the 7th of October. And that becomes the dominant story very quickly if you look at the media narrative and also the political narrative. And so let's take the example of the British government, but you could be looking at Europe, we can be looking above all the United States. So having the reaction of the British government, first of all, is from David Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, and from Rishi Sunak, is to reject the ICJ. This is one of the most senior courts in the world. They just simply reject its findings. They say they don't agree with it. And they say it's furthermore, it's not helpful. This is Cameron's language. Sunak, according to this Daily Telegraph the following day, which actually said that it was a sort of dark irony that this court should level these terrible accusations against Israel. And so it stands firmly with the Israeli government. This is the position of the British government against the International Court of Justice. At the same time as picking up instantly on the UNRWA allegations, which we saw come out of Israel. They immediately closed funding. They said how shocking these allegations were. And that becomes the story, not the ICJ ruling. We're talking about the Western media here and the Western politicians. It becomes the UNRWA allegations. And then, by the way, they are only allegations. I'm not saying, I have no idea if they're true or not, but all they are is allegations. And immediately the West responds by ending funding for the leading humanitarian agency in Gaza. At the same time, it's not reacting at all, but it's trashing the findings of the court in the context, by the way, of, I don't know, 30,000 plus people having been killed by Israeli action in Israel, in Gaza over the last few weeks, last 2-3 months.
I mean, it strikes me as a kind of contagion. Israeli far-right politics, long portraying the United Nations, etc., as basically part of a global terror network. Donald Trump for a long time was portrayed as a threat to the liberal world order as such, as it was described. But you have now, after the UN, after the top court on earth, but the UN top court, the United Nations top court puts Israel in the dock. Immediately then, Israel manages to put the United Nations in the dock, but with the direct complicity of Western governments, who are then based on 0.04% of staff of UNRWA being accused of taking part in atrocities or unspecified crimes. We don't know what involvement at all. The US hasn't apparently even seen the evidence, they've said. But it's almost like the Israeli far right has these narratives about the United Nations, etc. Now they're just it's spreading. It's been adopted as Western official policy.
It's very hard to explain, but if you look at it in a big way, I look back to the 1930s and the rise of the dictatorships, and that what we were taught at school was that the Western democracies were challenged and destroyed by the dictatorships. What we're seeing now, the threat to Western democracy comes from Western democratic liberal states themselves. We're having the global order. The threat to the global order very largely comes from the United States, of course, Britain and its allies, in their denial, that lethal attack on the institutions which were set up after 1945 to make sure never again. So the attacks are on the United Nations all the time. Gutierrez has been targeted, who I think has emerged wonderfully well from this crisis.
The Secretary General of the United Nations. Yeah.
The Secretary General, Antonio Gutierrez, the former Prime Minister of Portugal, has emerged as the most improbable leader of the world, certainly of what people call the global South, at this time of massive global crisis, which somehow is centered in Gaza, but extends all over the rest of the world as well, as the spokesman for the poor, the oppressed, and also, above all, as the spokesman for the rule of law and the global world order. And suddenly we have emerging in this context rogue states. Now, we've been taught to think of rogue states as sort of Saddam Hussein's Iraq or
Iran,
Gaddafi's Libya. But the rogue states today in this situation, the ones waging war on the rule of law and the institutions which were set up after 1945 is the United States of America, point one, under Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak's Britain, most of Europe, with certain not rather noble exceptions, and this is quite terrifying and frightening that we ourselves have turned on, refusing to acknowledge the rule of law. Because you can look back at the history of this, you can look back at the repeated ways in which Britain, think about the Rwanda business. We have generated a collection of leaders who despise the rule of law, particularly international law. It's what they call foreign courts, etc. And the same in the United States, which has become insular and got a horrible far-right narrative has evolved in the United States. And that is, I think, and so it is set up to attack the United Nations, which is by no means perfect. I'm sorry, we're not saying that, but it's our best hope of a decent future, international, global future.
One of the many reasons I wanted to talk to you is, to be blunt, I feel like I'm going mad. This is therapy partly. No, it's the media. Look, I've worked in the British media for a much shorter period of time than yourself, 12 years now as a columnist, and you've been a reporter as well as a commentator. So you've done, and you've worked in TV. You've done a whole range of roles, very senior roles in the British media. I didn't have any illusions in the British media and the Western media in terms of racism, in terms of, I don't know, unquestioning kind of official Western foreign policy, that kind of thing. I have to say, it has been not surprising, but a profoundly shocking experience, just in terms of the sheer level of dehumanization of Palestinians, just in terms of the way that blatant, unapologetic atrocities are normalized, are ignored, even apologized for by people who call themselves respectable, moderate, all that kind of thing. And even how, for example, the relentless, whatever people think about whether it's genocide or not, it is objectively genocidal rhetoric, and the ICJ ruling noted examples. That hasn't even framed the coverage. Most of that hasn't been mentioned. So people occasionally go, oh, the IDF is discipline breaking down, without noting Yoav Gallant, the defense minister of Israel, a few days after 7th of October, saying he'd released all restrictions on Israeli soldiers, which I think probably has something to do with it. What do you think about it? You worked in the media all this time. What's your general sense of how this is being framed and reported on?
Quite amazing that, as you say, and I listed in the ICJ document many of the genocidal remarks by members of the Israeli cabinet. And not once has any British politician raised any problems with that. There's been no complaints, no rebukes, not from Sunak, not from Cameron, not from Starmer, etc. Not one of them have ever raised it. And same with the media. You have to understand, in Britain, the media and politics have largely merged, particularly when it comes to issues like this Gaza tragedy. And so not once did a British media person who has access to Sunak or Cameron put these genocidal comments made by Israeli politicians and soldiers, etc., at the British politicians and say, what do you think? How do you react? And until Michelle Hussein, to her great credit, did it on the Today programme a couple of weeks ago when she was interviewing Grant Shapps, and he claimed not to know about it. Well, ridiculous. He is, after all, the man who is involved in making, defence cooperation with Israel, and he claimed not to know about what this disgusting discourse has emerged at the top level of the Israeli state. So that's the first thing, and it means that the British media is collaborating in what the International Court of Justice deems to be a potential genocide. And
no, go on. Sorry, go on. So I think just go on.
And that's the first thing, that there is a failure of journalism at a very deep level, and you saw it again. It's a minor example on the Lerner Kuensberg show on the Saturday morning after the ICJ verdict. There's 2 days. She had a cabinet minister on, and she had a shadow cabinet minister on. She just didn't raise the subject. For her, the ICJ ruling wasn't there. Didn't ask anybody about it, and so it's sort of swept under the carpet. Within 48 hours, it wasn't a story at all. And for many papers, including the Times, it wasn't a story when it happened. And you've got to remember that, when the South African complaint took place, and there was 2 days of court hearings, the BBC, it didn't cover the South African case. It didn't give a live stream of that, but it did give a live stream of the Israeli answer. There is and I'm told that Sky TV did the same thing as well. So there is a structural bias of epic proportions, and you've got to say that it's racist. If what's happened in Ukraine, supposing that the Russians had killed, look, the figures are extraordinary. They've done what the Israeli assault on Gaza has created more damage than the horrendous damage done to Aleppo in sort of 4 years. They've done more damage in 3 months, twice as much as Mariupol, but in 3 months, etc., etc. Now, and this is not, and in the denunciations, correctly so, of Assad, of Putin, for those atrocities, but nothing. Again, from the British media, in fact, a defence, and the same applies to our woeful, hopeless, morally bankrupt political class.
But before I ask you about that, just on the media, it strikes me that the way this is framed still is either this is basically Israel defending itself against Hamas with a side debate about whether it's proportionate or not, which we can agree to disagree on. Kind of that's the approach without looking at the just colossal war crimes being committed. Clearly, they're not looking at, they wouldn't look at other such onslaughts which are less devastating as is this proportionate or not. But the other thing is on Twitter, you can sort of lists, which I've done, of political journalists in the UK, and I basically put all of them in. And on the day of the ICJ ruling, on the day of South Africa giving evidence, not a single journalist spoke, tweeted a single thing.
Is that right?
Nothing. No, I went through the whole thing. Lucky me. I have to, when I go through that list of tweets, I have to mentally prepare myself off. Often lots of trivial stuff about soap opera politics, but nothing about whether or not the British government is complicit in an alleged genocide, which I would argue is of some political importance.
Again, I was very struck by the BBC News at 10, which I watched on Friday evening. The top item on the BBC News was the latest thing in the Trump soap opera, a court case involving Trump. Not unimportant, but astonishing that it should have been chosen to lead the news above the second item, which was the ICJ. And then it was once again, it was a very on the one hand, on the other hand presentation. And above all, I couldn't understand this coming from what claims to be a serious news organisation, the BBC, with, I would have thought, an interest in British politics. But the consequences for British politicians. So you had, in advance of the ICJ, Sunak and Cameron trashing the judgment, saying it was a bad thing to be happening, and it shouldn't be happening, and there was no case. And Blinken has said it was meritless, the South African case. And suddenly you've got the ICJ, which is hugely respected, one of the most respectable British lawyers on it. And I thought, I was waiting for them to say, what did this create a problem for the British government? Or what's the reaction of Downing Street? They didn't. They ignored that issue. And you've got to think there's a structural issue in reporting at the BBC here. Actually, it was quite amazing the way in which the British media and journalists generally have failed to understand or grasp what is going on. And your list of people who didn't react, who regularly provide their opinions on this, that, and the other. Silence is a form of complicity. And can we make another comparison? Well, we have all of these. The media class is very powerful in Britain. They're hugely respected figures. They get paid astronomical sums of money in many cases. National figures, greatly admired, profiled, and they're silent on this. Now, let's compare them to the journalists operating today in Gaza. I mean, I find myself quite close to tears just thinking about what they're doing.
So,
I mean, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists, more than 70, I think it's 78 when I first looked, but it's more have been killed. And they're killed reporting one of a slaughter and atrocities. Their families appear to be target. Israel denies this, but their families appear to be targeted. They appear, Israel denies this, to be targeted. But lots of, I mean, the number, I think it was 67 killed in the whole of the Vietnam War, I read somewhere. More than 70 here killed in Gaza. Now, basically, the British media ignores that. I mean, in two levels. You've got to compare the sort of insouciant obsession with trivia in the British media from our great media journalists.
Like it's a soap opera.
Secondly, the way they ignore the plight of our colleagues who are being killed in great numbers in Gaza. And so it's not simply that the BBC has completely failed to compare the Telegraph, the Times, the Mail, which didn't cover it at all. By the way, the story the day after, but gave a great leader page denunciation of the ICJ, called it a show trial. And it's very interesting. It wasn't just the Mail that called it a show trial. So did the Economist. So you have the great weighty Economist, all those boffins in Grand Office in, I think it's still in Mayfair or somewhere like that. And the Daily Mail, these kind of faux intellectuals at the Economist call it a show trial. So do the demotic Daily Mail. There's a sort of collective view across the Daily Mail, across the British media. This is a show trial. Let's give some. There have been some decent exceptions. Financial Times, I thought it gave it a serious coverage. Yeah. And so let's hold up. There have been it's not universal, but it's pretty well universal failure. And when historians are going to judge this, there's something sick about the British media political class at the moment.
I mean, before I ask about the political establishment, I mean, what do you think about the idea that actually Western media coverage is actually lethal? It has lethal consequences, its coverage, in that the ICJ ruling should have been accurately described as a devastating judgment for Israel. Devastating. Yes, they wanted the case to be dismissed as somehow spurious. The ICJ, its judges near unanimously considered South Africa to have a plausible case which needed to be properly interrogated. And in the explanation for why, they went through the genocidal quotes of the Israeli government and the absolutely catastrophic facts about the humanitarian situation facing what they described as the protected people. They had protected people status, the Palestinians of Gaza. The Western media did not portray it in that way at all. It wasn't Israel has been placed on trial for genocide. It was no ceasefire imposed, victory for Israel, blah, blah, blah. And then actually let's go and talk about UNRWA, the main humanitarian agency, and this scandal involving 0.04% allegedly of its employees. That has allowed, I mean, Israel since you've had obviously the main humanitarian agency be throttled. You've had these protests against humanitarian aid being coming in, which is blocking humanitarian aid. And for one of the passings, the protesters, nothing. The Israeli army doing nothing to stop them from behaving like that. You've had an increase in civilian deaths. You've got the Israeli army in the West Bank trying to expand the conflict by committing war crimes, by dressing up as medical staff in order to go to a hospital and kill people. I mean, Israeli soldiers posting ever more genocidal stuff on social media. There is no evidence whatsoever that the Israel is even paying attention. It seems like they've done the opposite. But I think the Western media has something to do with that because they took the heat off Israel.
Hugely so. They just went along with an alternative story. I mean, they could have been headlines every day. Maybe there should have been. That Israel defies the ICJ and slaughters another 200 Palestinians. These here, and here. Then they would go to. It would have put pressure on Biden, Sunak, etc., to come out with statements, and it would have raised, condemning the fresh wave of Israeli atrocities after Israel has been put on trial for genocide. But that isn't what happened. It's something, instead, the narrative has moved away. It's been virtual radio silence in most of the major media about the findings of the ICJ, where there hasn't been, insofar as there hasn't been silence, it's been misrepresented, and then a new story has been created, which the media has fixated on, about UNRWA. That has lifted the pressure off the politicians, particularly of Benjamin Netanyahu, as he's allowed a new wave of attacks and slaughter in Gaza. And of course, that means that the British and American media, by the way, we used to think highly of the British media. Do you remember the days when we thought that they were sort of really tough, sort of realistic, honest people? And so of course, the media is deeply complicit in all of this. It is giving the green light for fresh murder and slaughter and war crimes and atrocities. I'm not going to use the word genocide because that's not been ruled upon. That will be litigated in due course. But we can talk about atrocities.
And an alleged genocide, I suppose. I mean, that's how the ICJ is. You can now officially call it that. Just in terms of the political establishment, the other thing I wanted to talk to you about, in terms of the Conservative government, obviously they're in power. Britain has something to do with the current mess historically, to put it mildly. But the Conservative government, for under Rishi Sunak, long time and critically embracing and supporting Israel in terms of the horror unleashed against Gaza. I mean, do you detect a change in approach under Lord David Cameron, who's now Foreign Secretary? Is that meaningful? And what's your overall take about the Conservative government's approach?
Yeah, I think David Cameron, up to a point, is better than his predecessor. I welcomed his appointment because cleverly wasn't up to the job. And there was an episode which I wrote about at the time, last August, and cleverly went to, but it's very telling. He went to the West Bank on a trip to Israel/Palestine. And he asked to go to one of these villages which have been obliterated by settlers, Ain Samiyah, not far from Ramallah, I think. And he was told he couldn't. The Israeli authorities told him he couldn't go. And I learnt this. Well, it wasn't publicized. I learnt this from sources inside Palestine. I rang up. I checked it out. It was true. But the point is this: that cleverly had asked to go and see the site of ethnic cleansing, i.e., the erasure of a village by settlers. They forced out the people who lived in the village. I wouldn't let him, and instead of making a fuss about it, going public, I'd not been like, why hasn't Israel letting me go to see Ain Samiyah? Cleverly just kept his mouth shut. Now and it wasn't just him. The Foreign Minister of Ireland and I think it was Norway did the same, and they'd also kept their mouths shut. But you see, this is how they knew it was going on. But when Israel wouldn't let them go there and say to the world, I'm at the site of ethnic cleansing, they just were silent. So cleverly was no good. There's an incredible. I was interviewed, I think, on Channel 4 News shortly after October the 7th, and he was struggling for words, and suddenly the Israeli foreign minister took over and answered for him. I mean, it was as bad as that.
So you're saying cleverly by name, but not by nature.
Well, I'm not going to make any flip comments. I just like to see a British foreign secretary standing up for what I regard as British values, and among British values are hostility, not refusal to tolerance war crimes. And so when Cleverly was moved, and Cameron came in, I thought, yeah, there is a potential for this being a better thing. And he did change the language. I think Cleverly had allowed Downing Street just to frame the whole. I think in the language of the diplomatic corps, Cameron took back the file from Downing Street on Gaza, and he changed the language. He started to talk about, which hadn't happened until Cameron, civilian atrocities against civilians. But unfortunately, and it was like Cameron's last chance. He's not going to get another. Labour will come in and he'll go back to making money in the private sector. I thought he had 9 months when really he was unsackable. He could, but then, of course, his reaction to the ICJ was appalling, and he just trashed the result. He said it was. It's amazing the way, not just Cameron, it's a sort of syndrome of Western politicians that when they're asked about atrocities in Ukraine, they're immediately able to talk with great authority about the appalling atrocities we condemn. When Israel commits atrocities, on the other hand, I'm not a lawyer. I can't say. This is one of, and Cameron went into this, and then, of course, he suspended British funds to UNRWA. Now, on the basis of allegations, whereas you had a very strong legal judgment from the ICJ, which much stronger than what you got from these allegations which came out from Israel, which has a record of making false. I mean, I'm not saying these allegations were false or right, but and they were taken seriously, acted upon at once, and as for the one humanitarian operation which offers hope to the people in Gaza, we stopped the funding, and so Cameron's response to that was absolutely an abomination. He has since made a pathetic little speech about possibly recognizing the Palestinian state, which his client journalists in the sort of Tory press have written up as somehow significant. And it does mean a slight move forward, but not much. I mean, Britain's always said that in certain circumstances we support a two-state solution. So it's not this great move which you've been reading about in the last couple of days.
And it's not like he doesn't know the reality. I mean, many years ago, he described Gaza quite correctly as a prison camp.
Yes, and yet, quite an interesting history of this. That when he was, and it's worth noting, I reported this story. I'm going to tell you 12, 14 years ago. Never followed up by anyone at all. In 2006, when Israel invaded South Lebanon, the appalling atrocities were committed, and actually the British shadow foreign secretary at the time, William Hague, condemned Israeli action as disproportionate. Cameron then received a visitation from the Conservative Friends of Israel, and he gave them a promise the Conservatives would not use the term disproportionate again.
Wow.
Now, but then to his credit, and I know why it happened actually, he did say that Gaza was an open-air prison camp in 2010, I think he said. This was on because of Chris Patton, who was one of his mentors as a young rising Conservative, and he got a briefing from Chris Patton, who was then chair of MAP, the Medical Aid for Palestine, a fantastic organization. And Cameron had been seized on that, and he made this remark. But it didn't stay with him, because in 2014, he was more or less with the Israelis in that which led Saeed Abbasi, one of the most
yeah. And
honourable. Yeah.
Well, she suggested, didn't she, that Michael Gove, for those who maybe foreign audiences, is a senior Conservative politician, had an impact on shifting David Cameron, for example, in terms of Islam. Saeed Abbasi thinks he pushed him into.
There's a chapter about Saeed Abbasi versus Michael Gove for the heart of David Cameron in my book, Fate of Abraham.
Which everyone must buy, by the way.
Well, I mean, but I did look, I was, at that time, I was the chief political correspondent of the Daily Telegraph. And I watched this battle for the soul of Cameron. It was but to begin with, that Cameron was quite a liberal-minded leader, you may remember, and he encouraged Saeed Abbasi to go out and embrace the Muslim concerns. And I have a chapter describing how Gove intervened really in this, and Cameron became moved away, and Abbasi eventually had to resign. It's a very interesting passage of British politics because not record, and I'm quite proud that I took the trouble to note what was going on, and we now have it on the record the way that Saeed Abbasi was effectively driven out of the Conservative Party. She remains a Conservative, but she was marginalised and ceased to have a voice. Whereas Michael Gove remains, of course, very much on the premises.
And for those who don't know, Baroness Saeed Abbasi is the most senior female Conservative Muslim politician, or most senior Muslim politician probably, and she's been completely isolated.
I think she's the first Muslim female cabinet minister Britain had. Extraordinarily articulate. I think
she is.
Would urge you to have her on this show if you.
Oh, I've interviewed her a few times. In fact, I interviewed about Michael Gove, and that became a newsline at the time. I want to talk to you finally about Keir Starmer and Labour, because David Lammy last week tweeted saying that throughout in response to the ICJ ruling, which you could say at least they said that Israel should abide by its ruling, but he said that throughout this, Labour has been clear about upholding international law, and that it just isn't true. Keir Starmer at the beginning suggested Israel had the right to cut off water and energy. He is a lawyer, a human rights lawyer by trade. He does understand the Geneva Convention. I know what Article 33 says on collective punishment, so I presume he does. He also led a case prosecuting Serbia on behalf of Croatia, in which he understood sieges to be illegal. In fact, that was the plank of his entire prosecution at the time. But also throughout, into Emily Thornberry, Lisa Nandy, David Lammy himself refused to condemn things like forcible displacement, cutting off energy, water. And also this whole line about we've been clear international law must be upheld. What they do is they're asked about war crimes, and all they say is, we think international law must be upheld. But that's a meaningless platitude, isn't it? If you're not prepared to say when international law is actually being transgressed, you're not criticizing a party for transgressing it, then you're just coming up with an abstraction which has no relation to actual reality. So what do you think about Labour as a whole response, basically?
Thank you very much for that analysis, actually. You put it extremely well. It's a very interesting thing, which we've had, not just from Labour and the Conservatives, but you get it from that rather weird White House spokesman too. We're insisting that international law must be obeyed at all times, well, in front of your eyes. That's a sort of devastating mixture of slaughter, use of phosphorus, kind of killing in cold blood. And this is, but they've always insisting that it's like there's a crime spree going on, and you've got to keep the. And you're saying that law and order must be observed, and you're doing that.
Exactly. You're watching some guy on a serial killer on the rampage. This is murder. We're clear the law must be upheld.
I'm afraid that Starmer's a tragedy. I mean, his support for collective punishment on pretty well day one was one of the darkest moments. He's leader of the Labour Party. I mean, coming from any politician who claims to support, have any idea what British values are, global values are, to support collective punishment, as Starmer did, and then to lie about it afterwards. And then, the next thing he did, he wanders off to North. I think it was the Jewish Labour Movement event about 2 weeks ago, and suddenly he says, "Oh, we're not going to back a Palestinian state."
Without Israel say so.
He abandons Labour's. He goes public. This actually happened quietly, I understand, at the Labour conference last year. But he spoke about it, I think, publicly for the first time at the Jewish Labour Movement. Now, why? I mean, if you think about the issue of the Palestinian state, and then he said, "I'm abandoning Corbynite policies." That was how it was. Well, actually, it was Ed Miliband who introduced the policy. And I think that's a dishonest thing. Everything is it's Ed Miliband who thrown the Labour Party behind a Palestinian state. And it was Starmer who's removed the policy of supporting a Palestinian state. Now, it's a very odd timing. I mean, 8 years ago, there was at least John Kerry had some sort of peace process going in 2014. Today, we have an Israeli government which is absolutely clear it doesn't want a peace process. It's had no interest in a two-state solution, and let alone a Palestinian state. And that is the moment when Keir Starmer gets rid of a Palestinian state. Now, the other thing, though, I would say to him is, why go into the Jewish Labour Movement, which is a partisan organisation? If you're going to make policy on a Palestinian state, you should do it somewhere like Chatham House. And after he made those remarks, I checked. He hadn't bothered, he's making policy on Palestine, not Israel, by the way. Had he consulted the Palestinian mission in London? No. So he just goes to a partisan pro-Israel movement, makes that announcement.
Yeah.
He's not interested in going to, he doesn't even bother to inform the Palestinians that he's doing this. Now, this goes back to your point where we started, that Palestinians don't exist in the mind of British politicians and media. It's a form of dehumanization. They're just excluded from the political process, and their future is going to be made for them by Britain, America, and pro-Israel lobbies in London, which get the kind of briefing from the Labour Party, but not the Palestinians. I find we need to find a new kind of discourse. I mean, we need to find a new way of doing business, haven't we? In my view, actually, watching the events of the last tragic, terrible events of the last 3 months, but also actually going back a long way, the sooner that America and Britain have lost all legitimacy in having any engagement with the Middle East, not just by the way, in Palestine, but you can look at the wider Middle East, our support of dictatorships, of despotisms, our sort of involvement in illegal wars, illegal invasions going back to Iraq. I mean, we have a terrible record, and I'm afraid that the last few months have just reinforced that.
Just very finally, how do you think this all pans out? I mean, I guess in the long view, I find it fascinating watching the kind of very right-wing, the West is in decline types who embrace this sort of onslaught, because, I mean, they never seem to learn anything. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya all accelerated the decline of the West. This is, I mean, it's a catastrophe for, I mean, I don't think the West Moral Authority was particularly strong in much of the world to begin with. But I mean, it lies dead, rotting in the rubble of Gaza now, and but also if you look now at the US, younger generations in particular, and the more pro-Palestinian ever, and they're watching on social media unbelievable horrors, and it's having a big impact. So, what do you think? I mean, how does this all pan out? Do you think this is hubris meets his nemesis for Israel, or will they just wipe out Gaza and get away with mass murder?
I'm not Nostradamus. I think we can just make certain statements. It's quite clear what Israel wants. It wants Palestinians out of Gaza. And I think one of the major mistakes which most Western commentators and politicians have made is not to listen to what the Israelis say. They're completely clear about it. and what they do. You know, if you eliminate, is it 60% of habitable buildings in Gaza? You're just trying to get them rid of them. That is and those all the negotiations with attempted negotiations with Egypt or Israeli minister saying that Britain will take some or they'll go to Africa. Let's just not be naive about it. That's what they are seeking to do. And the other thing which people, I think, don't quite wake up to is that Netanyahu, if you look at the polls, has got the support of the mass of the Israeli people. I mean, this war is popular.
Yeah,
it's waged by Israel. We have America, which is determined to support Israel come what may. And we have it's a very, and Britain, which insofar as we have a policy as whatever America does, it's pathetic. And can I just make a point on behalf of Mrs. Thatcher, the late Mrs. Thatcher, who I know that you were very fond of in particular.
Extremely, very close to my heart.
In 1982, Israel went into South Lebanon, was party to the slaughter in Sabra Shatila and a lot of Palestinian refugee camps. She called it pure barbarism. Why and what Israel was, and I think I'm right in saying that Reagan rang up Begin and told him to call off the troops, and he did that afternoon.
The Prime Minister did at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there was a sense of morality in the West, that we don't condone mass slaughter, and this was Reagan and Thatcher. And what's happened since, that whatever Israel does under the most right-wing leader it's ever had, with a government which contains fascists, and yet we don't have a problem. We can't have any problem at all. And I'm certain that Reagan and Maggie Thatcher would have reacted in an entirely different way to Biden and Sunak and Starmer. And why Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, goes along. In fact, he keeps on getting outflanked to the left by the Tories. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. What the rest of the world sees is that our claims to represent human rights, decency, morality, rules-based world order, all of these conceits of the West, which are always bogus in many ways, have been completely destroyed. They're utterly worthless. It breaks my heart. I mean, what is Britain about? What do we stand for? Slaughtering Palestinians in Gaza? Is that what we're all about, is it?
Well, I think a profound lesson has been taught to much of the world. And I think there's a certain naivety about how the rest of the world sees the West, because they're watching all of this. And I think they've learned a lesson which is going to have very profound consequences for generations to come. I think everyone can see why I wanted to speak to Peter, and I've taken far too much of his time. So I'm very proud, very honoured to have been joined by you. But the least people can do is to buy his brilliant book, Faith or Abraham. I think that's just giving something back, given we've been in receipt of your profound wisdom and your experience. So do share this video or podcast, depending how you're watching or listening to this. Press like, subscribe, but most of all, Peter, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.